Thanks for having me, and thanks for tuning in. 10:30 here in Australia, so I'll try to keep it up because normally this time I'll probably be in bed. But it's good to be chatting to all of our friends in the UK, and hope you are all doing well. So the springtime here in Australia, so it's a really nice time where we finish pruning. The vines are starting to move, the buds are starting to move, everything is green. So it's a nice time to be in the Clare Valley at the moment. But I want to take you back to where we started. I'm the third generation, but it started back in the 40s with Grandpa Jim, who was one of the pioneers, not only the pioneers of the Clare Valley, but one of the pioneers of the Australian wine industry. So if we go back to post First World War, prior to that, from around 18, from when Australia had was colonised by you guys, we up until about 1915, we were making a lot of port, sherry, brandy, and sending it back. But after World War One, that all came to an absolute stop. So the Australian wine industry had to kind of reinvent itself pretty quickly because we're so reliant on those fortified varieties. So what happened then was the South Australian government set up Roseworthy Agricultural and Enology Viticultural University, and actually taught students how to make table wine, because there was it's around a similar time, a little bit later, but 1940s, a lot of Italian and Greek migration into Australia. So Melbourne is the second biggest Greek population outside of Athens, and all the European migrants that came out to Australia had a thirst and a culture for drinking table wines with their food rather than fortified. So Australia, who always relied on fortified, had to adapt, and especially when we stopped sending fortified back to the UK, we had to adapt. So the university set up the course, and Grandpa Jim was one of the first intakes. So he went through the course. It was a 2-year intensive course, and only 6 students could do the winemaking course because that's how much apparatus that they had. So Grandpa went through the course, finished in 1947 as the 17th qualified enologist in the Australian history of the industry. So one of the really early winemakers in Australia, number 17. And out of the 6 students that he went through Roseworthy with, 3 of those students were going back to their family wineries, and that was like Hardy. It was the other one. One was going back to Barossa, and one was going down to Coonawarra, and the other one, the Buller, I think was going to Victoria. So there's only 3 students for the industry, and Clare Valley, which is we're just north of Adelaide in South Australia, 2 hours north, had never had a winemaker before. So the Clare Valley Cooperative, which was one of the main wineries at the time, there was only 4 wineries, and the cooperative was the main winery, which had lots of small growers. They applied to the university for a winemaker to come and work at Clare. So Jim came up in 1947, and the co-op was so keen to get Jim working for them and be their winemaker. He was only 22 years old at the time. But he negotiated a wage of £7. So they offered him 3, and he came back and said he would do it for 7. And at that stage, the equivalent, the local doctor would have been on about £3.50. So he came into the region, 22 years old, first winemaker, on a pretty good wicket. But he was pretty. He was a good negotiator and a good businessman, and that's kind of how he set himself up at the co-op. But within a few years, he was starting to transition and starting to plant the seed in the local community about the importance of table wines, and starting to make more table wines through the co-op, and encouraging growers to do that. But one of the really early relationships that he had, and when we talk about the Kirribilli Cabernet, I'll touch on it more. But Sammy Wynn, who founded Wynn's Coonawarra in the 60s, at that stage, he was a wine merchant in Melbourne, and Grandpa went over to Melbourne as a student, and became friends or acquaintances with Sam Wynn. So he had an avenue to sell wine, and they actually together they developed the first refrigerated shipping truck. And he used to, on a Sunday, he used to arrive in Clare. Grandma used to fill it up. The wine, this was table wine, things like Shiraz, Cabernet. And in those days, they were called claret and Burgundy. If it was more tannic, it was claret. If it was less tannic, it was called Burgundy. But the wine used to go across overnight to Melbourne, be bottled up in Melbourne, and then supply the community, predominantly Greeks and Italians at that time. So it was always definitely at the forefront of the table wine movement. But something, and he's always championed that. But something which was pretty significant. This was in the 60s. What he did was, after his sixth child was born, he was thinking about the future, and he wrote this letter, which is going to be hard to see. But it was in the 15th of June, 1966. And he wrote a letter to all of the, not just the members of the co-op. He wrote a letter to all the grape growers and winemakers in the whole region, and said, "This is the future. Riesling, Shiraz, Cabernet, Malbec. These things are the future. There's migration. People are eating and drinking and there's more culture in terms of food and wine culture, and fortifieds are not the future." So he said anyone who would consider planting Riesling, Shiraz or Cabernet, that he would give them cuttings at no charge. He would give them 1-year-old rootlings that they could plant that year at no cost. So, which was pretty visionary for the 60s, to give effectively your competitors free material to end up competing with you. But he thought the region as a whole, if the Clare Valley region wants to survive and prosper, we had to become a table wine producing region. And that was June 1966. Fast forward 54 years, and now the family has 350 hectares of vines in Clare, and they're made up of Riesling, Shiraz, Cabernet, Malbec. So what he identified in the 60s, which was pretty early to be spruiking those varieties, Shiraz, especially Cabernet, Malbec and Riesling, was pretty early to be spruiking those. 60 years later, 50 odd years later, that's what we do there. We planted other varieties during that time, but we're back to those core varieties because they're the varieties that work best in Clare. So during his time at the co-op, and in the early 60s, he started to get ready to do his transition out of the co-op and do his own thing. So he started planting vineyards and purchased his first vacant 70 acres just north of the winery, an area called Armagh, from a local dairy farmer called Duncan McRae Wood. And while he was working at the co-op during the week, on the weekend he was planting vineyards. And and this was the old way of planting vineyards, which was with a shovel. So you digging holes with a shovel, digging post holes with a shovel, putting posts in, planting vines, and doing this on the weekend. And that was in 64, started doing that. And then in the late 60s, 69, the Taylor's family, which is known as Wakefield Estate in the UK, Grandpa actually entered into a joint venture with the Taylor's family, who were Sydney publicans, to build their winery and plant their vineyard. So he left the co-op in 69, went and set up the winery with the Taylor's family in Auburn, built the winery, planted 300 acres of Cabernet Sauvignon, which doubled the plantings of Cabernet in South Australia. So that was the late 60s. There was less than 300 acres of Cabernet planted. They doubled the planting because the Taylor's family and Grandpa thought that Clare was a really good area for Cabernet, and it has turned out to be a very good area. We still grow a lot of Cabernet in Clare. He set that up for the Taylors, and then he decided, as a joint venture, then he decided he really wanted to do his own thing, not the joint venture. So they parted ways. He left them in a really good position, built the winery, planted the vineyards, and then went in and built our winery in 1973 for the 1974 vintage, where we are right now. So during since building the winery 40 years ago, we've added vineyards, and Dad's taken over, and now my brother and I are taking over from Dad. So my brother Tom's a winemaker. I'll more look after the business side of things, but with being a small family business, we all have crossover from the vineyards to the winery to the marketing and the travel side of things. But going back to that letter, while Grubhub was at the co-op, he dealt with a lot of growers, and back in the 1940s and 50s, and to a certain extent still today, is that grape growers are incentivized to produce more fruit to get a better return. The winemaker wants lower yields to make the best wine. So there's always been a bit of loggerheads between winemakers and grape growers, because their vision is not aligned, because one wants to maximize the yield in their return, the other one wants to make the best wine. So the initial family philosophy that Grandpa had was plant your own vineyards, grow the best grapes you can, and control your destiny. So he planted his first vineyard, first vine, which was actually Malbec in 1964. And since that time, it's remained the family philosophy. So fast forward to 2020, we have 17 vineyards in Clare, 350 hectares in Clare, with another 40 hectares in Coonawarra. And that supplies all our needs for our wine. So we don't need to go out to the market and buy fruit. We can grow it ourselves. And as a bit of a fact, it costs us about 40% more to grow our fruit than a grape grower would cost to grow fruit, because we put the extra 40% is input to get that extra quality. And I think that's the reason why we have been successful, is because we've always invested in vineyards, always planted vineyards, and that's given us a good base. So as we grow our vineyards and keep quality up. And last year we were awarded the James Halliday Winer of the Year, which is probably the most prestigious accolade that an Australian winery can receive. Henschke just won it this year. So we're in very good company. But that really, the foundation for what we do today was really set by Grandpa, where he said, it was always always focused on, planting vineyards, owning vineyards, because he knew that the quality happens in the vineyard, and in the winery you can only mess it up. You can, you can't actually really improve on the fruit in the winery. The job of the winemaker is to actually just take the grapes and make the best wine out of them, and capture the quality of the grapes and transition that into the bottle. So if you're growing really good fruit, it's easy to make good wine. So I'll come back and talk about a few other threads and stories throughout. But I understand that most of you have got these three wines in front of you. So let's kick off with Assyrtiko. Riesling is a predominant variety that we grow in Clare. It's actually the only other variety apart from Assyrtiko that we make. And in terms of our company, it's about 50% of our production is Riesling. So Clare Valley, as a region, probably should touch on this at the start, but as a region, we're quite north in terms of, we're in South Australia, but in terms of latitude, we're actually quite far north in terms of Australia. So the Hunter Valley is a similar area, similar northerly area as us. which normally in Australia, in the southern hemisphere, the further north you go, the hotter it gets, as opposed to Europe, the further north you go, the colder it gets. In Australia, the further north towards the desert, the hotter it gets. But the reason why Clare Valley has been such a successful region, and the reason why we can produce Riesling as well as Shiraz, is we've got altitude, but we've also got a really high diurnal temperature. So we get really hot, warm days, but at night, the temperature can drop from 40 degrees down to 12 degrees. And that means that diurnal shift in the cool nights really gives us the ability to retain acidity and freshness, not only in our Riesling, but also in our red wine. So hence Clare Valley reds are normally more medium-bodied, elegant than say Barossa, which does rich wines better. We favour elegant wines in Clare. So on that, we're always looking for new sites, for cooler areas, because we've definitely seen the influence of global warming in the Clare Valley. And as opposed to 30 years ago, we're harvesting our grapes a month earlier. And what happens every day you get earlier, it's like it's a compounding effect, because if you're harvesting in February as opposed to March, you've got more sunshine hours, you've got warmer temperatures, warmer days, warmer nights. So if the cycle of vine starts to come forward a week, soon it's 2 weeks, because the ripening's accelerated as well. So 30 years ago, we were harvesting in sort of March, April, and the harvest might have lasted for 8 to 12 weeks in Clare. And nowadays, we're harvesting a month earlier, and everything's more compressed. So it's not uncommon for us to pick Riesling, Shiraz and Cabernet at a similar time. 30 years ago, it would have been unheard of to pick Cabernet at the same time with Riesling. But in that, we're looking for varieties that cope well with heat, and also are going to potentially cope, or will cope well, with drier, warmer, more unpredictable conditions going forward, because we've definitely seen less predictability in terms of the weather. For example, the last 2 years have been 2 of the driest years we've ever experienced. So with that in mind, we're looking for things that will adapt and that are going to drought-proof us for the future. And this wine, the Assyrtiko, was quite fortuitous, because Mum and Dad were in Santorini on holidays. Dad didn't know anything about Greek wine, didn't realise there was an industry, a really thriving industry, didn't realise that what Assyrtiko was, but was on Santorini and just drinking the local wine with grilled octopus and lamb. And he came and tasted Assyrtiko for the first time, and that saline mineral character just absolutely blew him away. And he thought, well, how does it make sense that an island which is so hot, so dry, and has such difficult conditions to grow grapes, and how is it possible that you can produce such mineral, acid-driven wines from that climate? So he thought, well, if anything can thrive so much on Santorini, which has about 300 mils of rain a year, which is the same rainfall as Uluru in Central Australia, the big rock. So rainfall out there is about 300 mils, and nothing grows out there. How is it possible that Santorini can produce these wines? So he came back to Australia. I got in contact with a few of the Greek winemakers, mainly Ayurgos, through import of their Konstantinos Lazarakis Master of Wine, the Greece's first Master of Wine. Got in touch with him to get an introduction to Santorini and these winemakers. And then in 2008, first visited in 2006. In 2008, he went back and took cuttings from these pre-phylloxera vineyards, which were somewhere between 300 and 400 years old. We're the first people outside of Europe to take Assyrtiko outside of Europe, and the first in Australia. So after spending 2 years in quarantine, we received 2 mother vines, and then we planted our vineyard in 2012. And what we've seen with our Assyrtiko is it's done what we wanted it to do, which is ripen later and also retain acidity. So we grow the Assyrtiko on our Lodge Hill site next to our Lodge Hill Riesling. And we're finding, even though that the Lodge Hill Riesling vines are getting close to 50 years old, and the Assyrtiko vines were only planted in 2012, we're seeing that the Assyrtiko ripens later and holds on to more acidity. So it is doing what we wanted it to do, which is ripen later, hold acidity, provide freshness. Because I think with white wine is, if you don't have that natural acidity, you're going to end up with something, which is quite fat and flabby and not something which is particularly enjoyable to drink. So we're really, really excited with this. How we make it is similar to Riesling, where we're looking to pick it at about 12.5 potential alcohol. We don't want it to get into that oily mouthfeel that Assyrtiko can go into if you push it up to 14.5% alcohol. We want to keep it nice and crisp and fresh. And what we found is that the vine has given us, even though we're not near the sea, we don't have volcanic soil, we're still getting that saline character in this wine, which is one of the hallmarks and one of the things we love about Greek Assyrtiko is, and Santorini Assyrtiko in particular, is that saline mineral character that you see. And we're finding, we didn't think we'd see it in our wine. We didn't know, but we thought, well, we're not near the sea. We weren't confident that we would see it, but we're really excited to find, especially after about 12 months in bottle, that varietal character of Assyrtiko, the saline, the minerals, has really come out. So, as I said, make it in a similar fashion to our Riesling. However, we do a little bit of barrel ferment. Because you've got such high natural acidity, we want to flesh it out and build that richness and give it a little bit of texture and weight. Because if we didn't do that, it would just be too linear, and too mean and lean. So we want to get a little bit of generosity and richness, without that oiliness that you get from leaving the grapes on the vine for extended ripening. So 2018 as a vintage, it was a really nice vintage. 17 was cold. 2018 was about average in terms of heat. Probably a very, very good red vintage in Clare. But what we found with the Assyrtiko is it's just retain the acidity. It's hard to see through the camera, but really pale in colour, which means that that hasn't oxidised throughout the process. We haven't picked up oxygen. We make this wine in quite a reductive way because we want to retain those quite delicate aromatics. And compared to our Riesling, it's going to touch on the tropics, a little bit more of that tropical, not so much tropical, but more exotic fruit, and a little bit more salinity and sort of saline, briny, almost like a Fino, kind of not a Fino sherry, but that's kind of that salty sort of Manzanilla, saline character, which you see down in Jerez. So. Well, that's the Assyrtiko. If you're tasting this for the first time, I think it's almost a combination between Clare Riesling and you see some of those Clare characters, that lemon and lime, but also the texture and the salinity that you would find in Santorini.
I had a couple of questions come in, Sam. I love the Assyrtiko, by the way. It's such a great wine. Do you use the traditional basket vine trading they do in Santorini in your vineyard?
The first row we planted in the Coonawarra of the baskets, and then we planted the rest on the trellis because we wanted to compare and contrast because we didn't know what one would be the best. But we planted a vineyard 2 years ago that was going to be completely baskets. But what we found is that the fruit in the basket that sits on the soil actually doesn't retain its acidity because the fruit that's sitting on the hot ground at night, you don't get the airflow and the temperature of that fruit stays warmer. So we actually prefer, and what we're doing is we should prefer on the trellis because the fruit can get more airflow, the fruit can cool down and retain acidity. And that means that we can get more hang time. We can leave the grapes to ripen longer because we've got the acidity in the backbone there, and get more complex flavors and aromatics. So we try both, but in Australia it seems, or in our vineyards it seems like getting the fruit off the ground, getting that airflow is really important.
Yeah, makes sense. Perfect. I'll let you crack on. Thank you.
All right, thanks for the question. And the 18 is in a really good spot. So it's still super fresh, but with an extra, say, 2 years, we're just bottling in 2020. With that 2 years of bottle age, that Assyrtiko varietal character definitely comes out, and also that texture, that sort of fine, chalky, sort of mineral texture that you see in Santorini displays itself more. So we'll keep trucking on. We'll go down to Coonawarra with our Kirribilli. So I was talking before about Grandpa's connection and friendship with Sammy Wynn, who went to Coonawarra in the 60s and purchased the original Riddick property, which John Riddick was the founder of Coonawarra in terms of a viticultural sense. And he planted a lot of vineyards up to the 1960s. And Sammy Wynn, who was a Jewish wine merchant in Melbourne, came across to Coonawarra, established Wynn's Coonawarra, and created one of Australia's leading Cabernet producing wineries. But Grandpa and Sammy retained a friendship throughout their whole career, and Grandpa loved the classic Coonawarra Cabernet, the cassis, the tannin profile, the elegance, the medium body, and he really liked the contrast as opposed to Clare Cabernet, which is a little bit more mid-palate richness, a little bit rounder, doesn't have the spine and the architecture of the Coonawarra. So he always had a hankering and a desire to make Coonawarra Cabernet, have a vineyard in Coonawarra. So in the late 90s, Dad and Grandpa drove down, 1997, they drove down to Coonawarra for a look because Jim wanted to have a bit of a sniff around. At that stage, in the late 90s, he would have been in his early 70s, coming to the end of his winemaking career, and the opportunity hadn't presented itself to buy a vineyard. So he kind of pushed the envelope and said to Dad, "Let's go and have a look, have a sniff around." And they were driving down into Penola. And if anyone knows Coonawarra, you've got the highway that runs down the middle of the region, and then you've got a thin sort of, they call it cigar. So it's a cigar-shaped Terra Rossa strip of soil. And then off the Terra Rossa, it's about 10 kilometres wide, 5 to 10 kilometres wide, and 30 kilometres or 20 miles, 7 miles wide, 20 miles long. And that's this beautiful Terra Rossa over limestone soil. And then once you go outside of the Terra Rossa, it goes to sand or clay, which isn't as suitable to produce Cabernet. So there's not a lot of land on the Terra Rossa and Coonawarra, and Wynn's own most of it, and it doesn't really change hands very often because it's so rare as hen's teeth. So they drove down and they were coming into Penola, and on the right-hand side, just as they were entering the town, there was this old disused cricket ground, and it was just kind of a little bit derelict, and they'd played cricket on there for 100 years, but they'd moved the cricket field right into town, and it was starting to go derelict. So they got into town. Long story short is they found out who owned this property and approached them to buy it. And all the locals said, it's the Abbey family. They've owned this property since the 1850s, since Penola was, and the Coonawarra was settled, and then he's never going to sell it. But somehow, on the day they made him the right offer on the right day, and we bought the 30 acres of Terra Rossa, the old Penola cricket ground. And Grandpa, who was a massive, he grew up watching Donald Bradman, said, well, and a big cricket fan, he said, well, out of respect for the local community and the region, we can't bulldoze the pitch, so we'll leave the cricket pitch in the middle of the vineyard. We'll leave the pavilion and restore the pavilion. And the gum trees that line the property, we'll leave them and we'll floodlight them up so it looks really nice, because if you drive down the highway in the Coonawarra, all the gum trees that would have lined the region have all been pulled out to plant vineyards. So instead of, we sacrifice a bit of vineyard area to make the vineyard look really, really nice, because we were imposters coming into that region. So we didn't just want to bulldoze the history. But also, I'll just get a little prop. He also, as a big Donald Bradman fan, who was legendary for playing the cover drive, he had this on. Grandpa had this on his desk, and he said when they made the first Cabernets, he said, "Wouldn't that be a great name for a wine, the cover drive?" And that's where some of you might be familiar with our cover drive, and that's where that kind of story was born. And out of Don Bradman and Grandpa's love of cricket. So we planted the vineyard down there in 1907, and then in 2010 we had the opportunity to buy another vineyard right across the road called Kirribilli Vineyard, which was a very famous vineyard back in the day in the 60s and 70s, and it'd fallen into corporate ownership, and they'd kind of let it go by the wayside, but it was right on the Terra Rossa, beautiful area. So we purchased the Kirribilli Vineyard in 2010, and it was quite different, even though it's only 100 metres away from the Penola Cricket Ground vineyard. It's quite different in character. So we put this under our single vineyard Kirribilli label, because it is quite different in character to what we find on the cricket pitch. So the reason we love Cabernet from Clare, but also if Cabernet from Clare is an oil painting, Coonawarra Cabernet is watercolours. You get that contrast. The wines are a little bit more elegant, more sort of, I suppose, classically structured Cabernet, nice and linear. You've got like an iron rod of flavour, and the tannins and the acid are kind of running in the same direction. With the sort of the herbal cassis, minty, eucalypt character, because the region's surrounded by gum trees, so that does impart that Aussie bush eucalypt character. So also with this range of wine, the single vineyard, we said, well, let's go back to the way that Grandpa would have made the wines, which was in large barrels. So small oak was really only came into the Australian industry in the 80s and the 90s. Barriques and hogshead. Prior to that, back to when Australia was first started making fortified wine. Everything it was foederers, it was big vats. So we make this in the 2,500 litre French oak foederer. So large format oak, just because we want to retain the purity of the Cabernet from Coonawarra, without that oak impact. And so I suppose you see in Bordeaux, it's a similar thing where you see amphoras and clay and large format concrete eggs, because I think there's a big trend in the world to retain purity of fruit, rather than say in the 90s where it was wines were being, as a generalisation out of Australia, wines were being overly oaked. So we're going back to more the elegant style of winemaking. And 2016, a beautiful vintage for Coonawarra. A little bit of kind of even like a lavender perfume, which is really beautiful, and a lot of violets and that sort of cassis, blackcurrant ribena character that we find. So we love Clare Cabernet, but also it's really interesting to make, and also intellectually stimulating to be making wine from another region, because it's different. It's different flavors. It ripens, at different times. Your canopy management, your viticulture also has to be different, because Coonawarra, it's got about 900 mils of rainfall as opposed to Clare's 600. So the viticultural challenges in Clare are water, availability of water, and having the vines, having enough water for the vines to drink. In Coonawarra, they've probably almost got too much water, so it's about foliage and canopy management. So you're not having too much canopy, which produces that green, green-edged, hard-edged Cabernet, which we don't like. So there's different challenges, which is really stimulating, as winemakers.
Would you say that it's only really the Cabernet that works well on a red soil, Coonawarra?
Yeah, generally we planted Shiraz when we first planted the vineyard, but within about 5 years we realised, no, it's not gonna fly. And where our vineyards are, we're right in the south. We're pretty much our neighbour from our vineyards is a town of Panola, so we're as south as you can get, which is so we're always, it's probably like the coldest vineyards in Coonawarra that last to ripen, so you can just get Cabernet ripe. But Shiraz, for some reason, on that soil, I think it becomes too vigorous and too waterlogged, and you get quite sort of really herbaceous, Shiraz. So Cabernet is. Some people have success with some other varieties, but it's Cabernet.
Are you looking at any other wine regions as well, other than Clare and Coonawarra?
Yeah, we've been making for the last 4 years. We've been making Riesling from Tasmania, which is really exciting. So Tassie has a very European climate, very continental, high rainfall, cool. So in terms of the Riesling from there, it's very, very dramatic in terms of its profile. So it retains really high acidity. Normally you balance it with a few grams of sugar, but much different to Clare Riesling, where Clare Riesling is bone dry. With the ripening window, you've got the acid dropping, the sugar accumulating. You've got like a little tiny window to nail Clare Riesling. In Tasmania, the ripening is much colder. The ripening period is longer. So you also develop different flavours, and it has a much different character. So that's really, like with the Coonawarra Cabernet, it's a different way of thinking, different winemaking, viticulture. It is stimulating to be working in other regions, because you got to take your Clare hat off and you got to put another hat on.
And hopefully the hat fits.
Yeah.
Thanks, then.
All right, good on you. So the next wine we're going to have a look at is our Barry Brothers Shiraz Cabernet blend. So I mentioned before that 1966 letter that Grandpa wrote to the Clare Valley, anyone who wanted to plant a vineyard with Shiraz, Cab, Malbec and Riesling, those varieties, and all the early wines that Grandpa made, and the wines that were being made in Australia in the 60s and the 70s were blends. And normally blends of Shiraz and Cabernet, which was is really a traditional, apart from obviously the Bordelais had been doing it for a long time, putting wines from Hermitage into their Cabernet. It's documented that was happening up into the 1900s. But Australia is really, almost, apart from the Bordelais doing it, Shiraz Cabernet is very classically Australian, and you don't see it in any other regions around the world. And it's something that makes sense and really works well in Australia, because you've got the Cabernet, which can sometimes be a little bit hollow in the middle, and you've got Shiraz, which has got that mid-palate, beautiful mid-palate generosity. So to plug Shiraz into the whole of the Cabernet, makes sense. And it's a variety, and it's a blend that if you get it right, it's a little bit cliche, but the sum of the two wines is greater than the parts. So you might have two silver medal wines, and you put them together, and you've got a gold medal wine, because the way that the Cabernet and the Shiraz interact is quite unique. So Grandpa was making Shiraz Cabernet blends and Shiraz, so Cabernet Malbec, Shiraz Cab Malbec blends. And then as a winery, as an industry, we kind of went away from that classic Australian blend of Shiraz and Cab. And then in 2002, we created the PB, which is originally was a blend of a Craywood Shiraz and a Ben Burney Cabernet. And that was Dad's private blend, because he absolutely loves the Shiraz Cab blend, because on different days and different times, and even in the glass, the wine, sometimes the Cabernet sticks out the Shiraz. And I think the analogy that I like to use is the blend of Shiraz and Cab is like an arm wrestle between, if you do it well, it's an arm wrestle between the Shiraz and Cab, where the Cabernet wants to dominate and then the Shiraz wants to dominate. So you're always seeing this tension between the two varieties. I think if you have a Shiraz and a Cab where you taste just Shiraz or just Cabernet, you've just kind of missed the point. But if you can see both aspects, and if there's kind of a tussle between the two varieties, that's when you really find a nice equilibrium. So, as I said, the industry and us as a winery went away from Shiraz Cab, and then we kind of got back into it with the PB. And then when my brother and I came back into the business, we really liked the blend. So we said, well, let's do something with Shiraz Cabernet. A nod to the past and the history of winemaking at our winery, also in Australia. But let's give it a kind of a modern interpretation, because probably the knock on Shiraz Cab was quite an old-fashioned style of wine, old-fashioned blend. So then we said, well, it doesn't have to be. You can have vibrancy and elegance in the blend. So we created the Barry Brothers, which was with the retro packaging. It's a nod to the past, but stylistically, it's much more of a style which is probably going to resonate with the modern consumers. So this wine stays in stainless steel. It's an unoaked Shiraz Cab, and it's all about freshness and vibrancy, because with those two, you've got beautiful perfume and fruit from the Cabernet and the Shiraz. You've got the acid, you've got tannin, you've got all the characteristics which you need. And this wine's not made to be aged for 10 or 20 years. So you don't necessarily need to have that oak influence. So we keep this in stainless steel. It's normally around 70% Shiraz and 30% Cabernet, all from Clare. And it's really fun, vibrant wine. So wine that you want to drink, and a wine that's really accessible and approachable for the modern drinker, which probably is looking for that elegance and vibrancy, and something which they can pair up with food really well, and something which is going to work across a number of different dishes. Yeah. No, it's not serious, but if you want a really serious Shiraz Cab, we have our PB, which is made, it's got structure, concentration. It's made to drink well in 20 years. And the Barry Brothers is a wine to drink now. It's made to drink now. Not that it doesn't have the complexity and that you'd want. It's got all that, but we make it because we know the reality is people go to the bottle shop, they buy the wine and they consume it within 24 hours. I think in Australia, 97% of wines that are purchased are consumed within 24 hours. So the reality is that's what people are doing. So we wanted a wine that people can, that's ready to go straight away. So when people buy it, it jumps out of the glass, it's vibrant, it's punchy. And when we made it, it actually started to clean up. It started to win the trophies at the wine shows for Shiraz Cabernet around the country because it was so different. All these wines in the Shiraz Cabernet category were quite old-fashioned, and then you got the Barry Brothers, which is really modern and fresh and vibrant. And I think the judges saw it in the lineup and said, "This is so different and this is so fresh." It really stood out. So for a wine which is in Australia is $20, it started winning the trophies, which is pretty cool for a wine which is affordable to be knocking off Shiraz and Cab that were 10 times its price. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. Few more questions come in. Speaking more generally about Jim Barry wine. Are you experimenting with any other different varietals other than things like Assyrtiko?
We're looking, the previous generation and Dad, we experimented a lot, and a lot of the things that were planted, most of the things that were experimented, it didn't work. Now, when we plant something, we've got more information and we can make better decisions. So, we're not going to. We planted Chardonnay and Pinot in the day, and if you look at that now, you say, well, it's just not going to be suited. But back then, the Australian industry was about experimentation, and which is a good thing because on paper you wouldn't come to Clare and plant Riesling. If you looked at it on paper, you'd say, no, you can't plant Riesling there, but it just works because of the cool nights and the soil and a lot of combination of factors. So I think it was important to experiment because you find things. But a lot of the experimentation of the things that we did wasn't successful. However, what we're doing now is we're being more targeted. So the Assyrtiko really, it was always going to work because it had its origins in Santorini. It's hot, dry. We're going to Mediterranean climate. There's a lot of similarities. Like Clare's got no similarities with Burgundy, so Chardonnay and Pinot are probably never going to work. But the next variety, the red variety that we've chosen, is Aglianico, because, and we didn't actually know. Obviously, it's most well known from coming from Puglia in the south of Italy, but Aglianico actually is origins, and we didn't actually find this out until we'd already planted it, is actually origins, and it was from the Jancis Robinson book. The origins of Aglianico is actually Greek. So it works nicely, and it's a variety that does really well in the heat. It can handle the heat, and we're really excited about how it's going to go in Clare. I've seen it growing in some other warmer climates in Australia, and it retains an acidity, really and really vibrant fruit profile, probably quite different to what we're seeing in Italy, which are more dark and dense wines. So we made our first Aglianico this year, and it looks really good. It's definitely more in that punchy, vibrant style. As the vines get older, we'll be able to experiment a bit more, but that's the other one that we're experimenting with. But apart from that, there's still a lot more we can do with Riesling, Shiraz and Cabernet, and different sites, different areas of Clare, row orientation, canopy management. There's a lot we can keep experimenting and trialing with those varieties that have already got a track record. So that's predominantly what we're sticking to, and the varieties that have worked in Clare for a long time, but just around the edges, playing with a few other things. Aglianico is the red variety that we're currently having a crack at.
Next big one. Are there any areas outside of traditional Australian wine growing areas that you feel could still be developed?
There's probably a fair bit of central Victoria. You've got Crawford River, Henty, all the way through there. You've got a lot of land and probably opportunity out there. Tasmania, a lot of people going down to Tassie and different sub-regions of Tassie because they're chasing the more European, cool climate European varieties like Pinot, Chardonnay, and Riesling. WA, you've got some really great wines coming out of Great Southern, which is a huge region. And so there's little pockets in there. So there's still a huge amount of area. But even within the Clare Valley, there's little pockets within Clare that we'll look to plant. And even in our own vineyards, there's some really steep slopes that in the past we would have said that they're too steep to plant vineyards, but they're not as steep as the Mosel, so we know you can. It's just going to be hard work. So we'll probably start to explore some of those really, really rocky, steep sites that would have been in the past. No one would have even thought about planting vineyards on.
Yeah, still a lot more to come then.
Yeah.
And the Clare Valley, what do you think the future holds for the region? Is it more experimental varieties or Riesling, Shiraz, Cabernet? Well,
I think the varieties that traditionally do well, I think it's still going to be the future. Mm-hmm. If things keep going on the same trajectory of global warming with vintage coming earlier, there's some of our vineyards now that we grow Riesling on, potentially in the future we won't be able to grow Riesling on that site, but there's other cooler sites we'll be able to find in Clare that we can still grow these varieties successfully. Same with Shiraz and Cabernet. There's some vineyards that may become too warm and not suited to those varieties. So we will start planting Shiraz and Cabernet on the south slope. So we don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's still so much we can do with these classic varieties, whilst also just keeping an eye on things like Assyrtiko and Aglanico, and because that's interesting. It's interesting to work with those varieties.
Some fun there as well.
Yeah.
And other than the wines that you produce, what would you say is your favourite style or region of wine out there?
In the world or in Australia?
In the world.
Oh, well, I'm a classic. I'm a classic. Burgundy man, and also Piedmont man. So they're the ones when I'm not, working with our wines. When I'm at home, I'm drinking. That's what I'm drinking. So that's where my brother, who is he studied winemaking. I didn't study winemaking, but I've done a number of vintages. He did the practical vintages and went to work for Erdy Lozen in the Mosel, Dernhoff in the Nahr, Bert Solomon in the Kremstal in Austria. Practical vintages. When I went to do my vintages, I went to Burgundy and Barolo.
The classic.
So, so nothing to do with what we're doing in Clare. Those varieties we never plant, but they're the regions that I absolutely love. So that's what's in my cellar. It's predominantly Burgundy, Barolo, and a little bit of Claret. Actually, I did jump on board the 2019s. I couldn't help myself on board. They were very keenly priced. So and now with our top wine, the Armagh, being Australia's first wine with John Riddick to go through Laplace to Bordeaux. I think I've probably got to start buying a bit of Bordeaux as well. So that's what I'm drinking.
Too tempting. Perfect. That's all we've got time for. Thank you very much.
Yes, sorry, listen, it didn't sound like an hour.
Yeah,
but we've been running for an hour, so
Yeah.
11:30. I've probably got to
Bedtime.
go to bed. But thanks for joining in. Hope we've got a bit of an understanding about what we're doing in Clare. We're passionate about Clare. We've been doing it for a long time, but I think there's still a lot to come. And I think Clare Valley as a region is so exciting because I think it really suits where the modern consumer is. And I think if there's a knock on Australia, it's from the world. It's Australia produces these big, ripe, jammy style of wine. Clare Valley's the wines we produce aren't like that. There's elegance, there's finesse. I think they definitely suit an English palate. More so than the wines that Australia was making in the 90s, which were probably more suited to an American palate. I think while Jim Barry's are always done really well in the UK, is because we make more elegant wines, which are more sophisticated wines, which they are more suited to the English palate.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much, Sam.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks for tuning in. And hopefully we'll be able to see you soon in person and see our customers in the UK. But Dad did his first export trip in UK in 1983. So it's our longest export market, and it's our most important export market. So it's great to communicate. It's always great to be in the UK and communicate with our English customers because it's our most important export market, and it's our first market. So it's a very special market for us.
Yeah, and we do love your wines.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sam.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for everyone at Holgarten, at Jim and Colin, and thanks for tuning in on a Thursday afternoon.
Yeah. Cheers, Sam. Good night.
Cheers.